So one of the things that I like to start with is well, Aristotle's a good place to start. Aristotle's always a good place to start. But he had this really cool idea, this really cool it's like a framework that he builds out as it pertains to ethics, and it's derived from the concept of beauty. And beauty is a really cool it's a concept, it's an idea. It's not just what we think of typically, like, oh, what a beautiful person, what a beautiful landscape. It is that, but it's a lot more. And the more that it is specifically kind of these relationships with things. um so it has to do with symmetry. There's symmetry in there's okay, let's start with this. Let me think of like a pyramid. When you look at a pyramid, it has a shape and it has an aesthetic, and that's cool, but it has a lot of other properties as well. And those other properties are like, it's a solid foundation and it's something you can build up on. And the reason for that is because of the specific relationship that's laid out. So it starts with a wide base, and it as you continue up, it starts to get more fine to a point. Once it reaches that point, this thing is complete, but it's kind of, all of these segments are resting on top of one another, and it has a foundation there. It's the same thing with ethics. So ethics is present in even that concept. And so if you look at it from this perspective, you can see all of these things are interconnected and related. So there's a relationship between the top of a pyramid and the bottom. And what is that relationship? Well, it's the top and the bottom, right? You couldn't have the bottom of the pyramid on the top. If you think about it inverted, then the base would be, up in the air, and it would be resting on a point. You can think of ethics like this. So there are certain relationships in things like pyramids, in something like a beautiful landscape or a beautiful person. Like if you take a face, one of the things that we consider when subconsciously when we're discovering or when we're identifying beauty in something is that we pay attention to symmetry. So if this side of your face looks very similar to this side of your face, like a mirror image, we tend to find that a lot more attractive. And if there's a lot of asymmetry in there, we tend to find that less attractive. Um, so basically, in these examples, what I'm laying out is there's a way in nature we can see already where things should be a certain way. And it gets hard. It gets hard. So this I will say is definitely like my own personal view. It's biased and it's from my subjective perspective. Is that these things that we've been talking about demonstrate that there is a way things should be. I mean, you can make, there's a lot of arguments for like, oh, you can't get that from, you can't prove that or whatever. But when it comes to like what you were talking about a little while ago, practicality, how do we implement these kind of like ethereal concepts into like some tangible structure that we can use as a tool? So what we have to do is we have to accept something or grant something like a presupposition. And what that is like, okay, I'm going to interface with the world in a way that works, quote unquote, right? And in order to do that, I have to do X, Y, and Z, and that will make A, B, and C. So once we establish these kinds of relationships, we build ethics around these kinds of relationships. Like, for example, I want to look more fit and I want to feel healthy and strong. Okay, well, you have to exercise. You have to go for a run. You have to lift weights. You have to, whatever it is, you have to watch the way you eat. You have to pay attention to these kind of things. Okay, that means that in order to do this thing or to achieve or accomplish something, there are a set of ethics that need to be adhered to in order to get the results that you're looking for. So when it comes to how we move in the world, everything we do is goal oriented. So what is the goal? What are you trying to do? And how you go about achieving that will be determined by what it is you want to achieve.
Right. So to summarize, the case that you're laying out is that ethics is the thing that builds that is the thing that acts as the foundation for everything else to be built on. So to use your pyramid example, it's the base of the pyramid on which everything else rests. But at the same time, you're saying, in the pyramid example, it's the higher you go, it leads towards a peak. But strictly speaking, in within ethics, there is no fixed peak per se. Where you aim at might be all sorts of things. So the aim is not a fixed position. Yet where you're coming from is like this base foundation, on which, yeah, what can we call it? The human experience, our learning path, our path to adventure. How can we define that upwards path? Is that a correct summary?
So yes, I think there's a little more to it as well that we'll get into,
Mm-hmm.
but that so far absolutely. Um, so there's this, that's correct. Like ethics is a foundation, but it's also present in every level in the pyramid,
Right.
and there are these relationships from one segment to the next. Um, so if you were to think about, if we stay with this analogy of a pyramid, right, and you were to think that every segment that you ascend is another goal that you're rising to in pursuit of an overall larger goal, and the peak would be the larger goal. It would be like a life well lived, which is something that people generally can agree on, that's a pursuit that's worth pursuing. How you do that, and this is what we're saying about kind of like those, what is the goal? How you do that will vary from person to person, but there are general truths, you could say, that people engage with and recognize. You can think of it from a perspective of like physics, like hard sciences. Like there are some things that are just are, like gravity or entropy, or these kind of things. Um, those things all have a relationship to us, to our goals, and to our ethics. So something like entropy, right? So we break down over time. People, that's what happens as we age and eventually we die. A lot of the decisions that we make, if you're a healthy mind, they will be affected by, if not guided by, that reality. Like we're here for a finite amount of time, and we have to do things. If we want a certain thing, if your goal is to be remembered or to have a legacy or whatever your goal is, to be thought of as a good person, there are things we need to do now in time, so that we can be thought of that way. And so a concept like entropy is related to the decisions I make right now.
Yeah, the concept of entropy is the idea of an action continually dissolving the experience into chaos. So it's a continuation into chaos instead of towards order.
Right. It's a return to chaos.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. So the natural state of things. Um, and so yeah, that's a great perspective there, Jeffrey. And if you think of it that way, then the actions and decisions that we're making on a regular basis, we are structuring or ordering the elements of our lives so that we're fighting that entropy.
Okay.
And so good ethical decisions are decisions that place the world in a specific orientation in your life in order for you to pursue your goals.
Is another word of saying this the upwards aim? And let me just clarify that a little bit, because you're laying out the idea of the base of the pyramid, so that ethics is like the base on which everything rests on. But it's not just the base; it's also the process of moving through the levels upwards. It's like Jacob's ladder, and where
Exactly.
Jacob's ladder is not just the thing that touches the ground. It's also the ladder itself, and it's also the process of moving up that ladder. That's
Right.
what ethics is. I think that's what you're saying. So it's not just it's the entire process.
Right. Right. So okay, absolutely. There's more. So these are like this is the others are the bones, and we'll put some flesh on them. Um, okay, so in moral philosophy, or in in the schools of moral philosophy, there are three broad, widely accepted schools of moral philosophy, and what these are these are systems, right? So they're systems of thinking that help you engage with the world, that help you make ethical decisions. Um, so we could let's start with Aristotle. So Aristotle, he he develops this idea of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a system of thinking that it basically says that ethical decisions can be expected to be made by this person because this person is a good person, because this person is an ethical person. So that's the broad strokes look, and it sounds a bit circular, but if you look at it, how you act that out. So he kind of lays out this framework of virtues and vices, and a lot of people tend to think of virtues and vices, or vices and virtues, um, as like a spectrum, and on this side there's one, and on this side there's the other one. But he kind of lays it out more in a way where the virtue is actually in the middle, and vices are on either side. And what that is like, take something like compassion. Maybe you could say compassion is a virtue. Compassion can be a virtue, but it can also be a vice. And so the
Depending on where it's
vices,
aimed at.
well, all yes, depending on where it's aimed at, depending on the quantity,
Hmm.
and depending on the context. So, um, for example, let's say you come to me as a friend and you say, you know what, I lost a family member, and it's I've been taking it really hard, and the thing that I respond to you is, man, I can't wait for the game to come on. You ready to watch? It's like, wait, whoa, I just shared something really like difficult and personal, and so I shared with you something I was struggling with, and you had no compassion at all.
That's going to be a
That's
very
a
fun
vice.
evening.
Right, right, right. Yeah, this doesn't make for good relationships.
Yeah.
That's a vice, right?
Hmm.
But also you might be overly compassionate in that situation in your response, and you might actually start to make me feel uncomfortable. Like, oh my God, I lost someone too. I know what that feels like. I'm so sorry. Here, let me go buy you a pizza. Let me go, do this thing, or let me buy you a car, or doing these things that are just weird and extravagant, or inappropriate to the situation.
Lingy. Yeah.
Um, right. And so what ends up happening is like, um, so he calls it kind of like a balance, right? You want to find a balance um, between these things that are inappropriate. You want to find the balance of the thing that is the appropriate response. So you want to show compassion. So probably a more appropriate response in that situation would be like, "Hey man, I know we had plans to watch the game. I'm really sorry to hear that you lost someone. Like, if you need to talk, if you just want to chill, you just want to go home, that's totally fine. Just let me know." That's probably a more appropriate response than either of those other things. Um, okay, so that's virtue ethics. That's virtue ethics. That's an example of virtue ethics. What you're doing is you're making choices and decisions. With every choice and decision you make, you're thinking about it from the perspective of what kind of person will this decision make me. So you're developing character over the process of decision making. Um, yeah. Do you have any questions about that?
What is the difference between a vice and a sin in this case? Is it just the philosophical versus the religious way, or is there actually a practical difference between those two?
That's a great question. Um, that's such a good question. Um, okay, so it will depend on your framework. So what is a sin to you is probably going to be a lot different than what is a sin to me. Um, there are some things now. This is where it gets dicey, where like people say, "Oh, you can't get an ought from an is." In terms of practical application conversations, you can. In terms of like what is objectively true or real, that's a different story. But in terms of like how we behave in the world and how we interact with each other, you can. This is how we build moral systems. So there's definitely, we have laws. So we obviously agree that there are better ways to behave and worse ways to behave. When it comes to more like, so now you're talking about morality when you say something like sin. Um, and this is different than ethics. And so it's a very interesting relationship between vices and virtues, because vices and virtues are they're elements of an ethical system, specifically virtue ethics. A sin is like wavering or faulting or missing the mark. Um, and it's in my view of the world, it's difficult to see sin outside of a religious context. So there's definitely, like, the way I see the world, there's definitely morality um in this term, right? So this is an element of a system of morality. That, so I do see it as different than like vices and virtues, but it definitely has a very similar function.
Right. Okay, so it depends on the framework through which you are looking at the world and looking at people, but there is a similarity between them because, like you said, sin is like missing the mark, and you said
Right.
that virtue is like in the center. So it's like that that Jacob's ladder, while going to the left or to the right. That's where
Yes.
the devices come in. So you're missing the mark then. So there is a kind of similarity between them, but they are elements of different frameworks that might have a relation with each other, but are not directly dependent on one another because they are parts of a different system, a different framework.
That's definitely the way I see it. Yes. And some people will use them interchangeably, but it's because their moral system is a lot closer to being directly mapped onto whatever ethical framework they're using. Um, my personal approach to these kinds of things, and I'll get to this in a little while, but I don't subscribe to any one particular school of moral philosophy, and I'll explain why. Um, um, but some, many people do. They'll use them as like as law, or people will, like, let's say for example, read the Bible, and they'll develop a system of morality out of what they interpret from the Bible. And so they will give prescriptions to people for what is proper behavior. This is how you should live your life. So they, in religion, you get that ought from well, people derive it from different things, but there's the relationship you have with ethics and morality. It varies from person to person, definitely. Um, yeah, yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it certainly does. It certainly does. Let's delve into the way that the different systems interact with each other a little bit later, because I'm especially curious about what you're thinking about. You're not subscribing to a single one, but you're taking.
Right.
I'm filling it in for you, so feel free to correct me. But I assume that you're taking the best parts, quote unquote, of the different systems and applying that in order to find the balance in life on what is right and what is not. But Anyway, feel free to correct me now already, but else let's dive into that specific element later. Um,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so the fundamentals, ethics. We discussed ethics. We discussed the first of the three schools of thought, so Aristotle. What are the other two?
Okay. So the next one that I'll go with is deontology. Um, okay. Deontology is basically like a prescription, a set of rules. Here is an ethical framework. You must behave this way. If you don't behave this way, you're in the wrong. If you do behave this way, you're in the right. Um, so there's this interesting thing here that's kind of that comes with it. I almost want to think of it as like smuggled in there. Is this concept? So the basis for being able to make these claims within this moral system is kind of like the dignity of the individual. And the reason that matters is because in order for a system to exist, that system has to serve a specific function, right? So systems are not accidents. Systems have purpose. And somebody has orchestrated a very specific intention, and they have added these little bits and pieces and parts that move to serve a very specific function. So, like in deontology, kind of accepting this as like an axiomatic truth is something that it would you would consider kind of like the dignity of the individuality, like respect and dignity toward a person, is the basis of morality. So you have to make your decisions based off of that truth. So am I violating a person's dignity when I do X, Y, or Z? If I am, this is unethical.
And where is that line being drawn? So if you, for example, insult someone or you say something that someone else doesn't approve with, does that violate that ethical system?
So okay, so this is kind of this is the rub when it comes to all of these. I'll just tell you right now, all of the schools of moral philosophy have problems. And what I mean by that is they don't answer all of our questions. They leave a lot of the process of ethical behavior in the hands of the decision maker. And in my view, that's the beauty of living and making choices and decisions. And that's the thing that allows you to be an ethical person or not, because otherwise you're just following some kind of programming, and there's not very much virtue in that.
Yeah, where's your humanity if you're just following a system? You're like a program in the Matrix.
Yeah, precisely. And what's an insult to me is going to be very different than what's an insult to you or to some other person on the other side of the world. So if I say something that is a thing that I say with my friends, and we understand that it's like, joking or out of fun, or, a way of like a term of endearment, another person will hear that and be like, that was very offensive, you know? Um, so did you commit an ethical violation? Good question. There, you can see now there's a lot of other considerations that need to be taken into account before you can determine whether or not what you have done is good or bad, right? Yeah. So, do you have any questions on that?
No, I'm good to go. What's the third one?
Okay. All right. So the third one is, so we'll just say utilitarianism. Basically, with utilitarianism, there is this kind of, okay. So it's summarized commonly as like the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which is very generic. um, but at the base of the decision making there, so the thing that kind of informs the value is what brings the most enjoyment or pleasure to the individual who's making the decisions. So basically, you take that framework and you expand it out to other people, and you're saying what's bringing the most positive feeling or most positive experience to the greatest number of people. And that is like that's basically what that is. But it sounds good. It sounds good initially, but the problem is that when you start subjecting any one of these schools of moral philosophy to, like, let's say, thought experiments, which is something that philosophers do a lot, they present these like ethical or moral conundrums, and they're like, okay, using this school of moral philosophy, how would you approach making decisions? Like, what is the ethical approach?
When we are talking about ethics, what do we mean exactly?
It's this interesting thing. It has to do with like a relationship with ourselves, but also with other people. Why did you do something? Well, I wanted to. Why didn't you do something? Because I didn't want to. You know, with every choice and decision you make, you're thinking about it from the perspective of what kind of person will this decision make me. Sometimes in order to pursue what is morally correct or morally good, in fact, often, you have to